One image. A dining table. France, 1928. Evening. Rose Kennedy was sitting across from her husband's mistress at dinner. She knew who Gloria Swanson was. She knew what Gloria Swanson was to her husband. Joseph had made no real effort to hide it. The relationship ran across 2 continents, in full view of anyone paying attention. Rose Kennedy always paid attention. Swanson wrote about this dinner in her memoir decades later. She said she had walked into that room expecting to find a wife who didn't know. What she found stopped her cold. Rose Kennedy knew everything, and she was passing the bread. Swanson wrote that she felt something close to shame, not for taking another woman's husband, but because she suddenly understood what she was sitting across from. Not a victim, not a fool, a woman who had learned, at enormous cost, that knowing changed nothing. The question nobody asked Rose Kennedy for the next 60 years. When did she learn that? And what did it cost her to stop fighting it? That is this story. What she had to be to get in. And what she gave up, before she understood the price. Rose Elizabeth Fitzgerald was born, in 1890, into a household where power was something men accumulated and women displayed. Her father, John Honey Fitzgerald, was Boston's Irish Catholic mayor, a charmer who understood, before most politicians of his era, that a family was a public instrument. His daughter was part of his social currency. Her mother was devout, capable, and absent from every historical account of that household. Not because she wasn't there, because the story was told as her husband's story. Her erasure was Rose's first lesson in how these systems work. She simply didn't know, at the time, that she was being taught. Rose was educated at Sacred Heart convents in Boston, the Netherlands, and New York. She was genuinely intelligent, French, German, serious music study, wide reading. When the time came for university, Honey Fitz chose Wellesley. Then the Archbishop of Boston intervened. A Catholic girl at a secular institution risked her faith, her standing, her eligibility within the only community that mattered. The Archbishop was the most powerful Catholic official in New England. Honey Fitz needed his goodwill. Rose went to the Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart instead. She said, once, that she never forgot the loss of Wellesley. She didn't elaborate. She never returned to it. That is the first rule of entry. Educated enough to run a household, not educated enough to build a life outside one. The line was drawn by men, on her behalf, before she was old enough to object. The marriage carried the same logic. Joseph Kennedy's family had money and no social standing. The Fitzgeralds had standing and political access. Joseph brought ambition and a willingness to operate outside the rules that more cautious men observed. Rose brought her father's name, her family's church credentials, and entry into the Irish Catholic establishment that the Kennedys needed to become what Joseph had already decided they would become. The exchange was structural. It was not discussed. They married on October 7, 1914, at Cardinal O'Connell's private chapel, a venue Joseph arranged, a location that communicated to every Catholic in Boston exactly what kind of family the Kennedys intended to be. Rose was the door. Joseph walked through it. What the door was not told, that its function, from that point forward, was to hold open and stop moving on its own. What she was never permitted to say, and what swallowing it for 80 years produced Joseph Kennedy's relationship with Gloria Swanson, was not a secret he kept from his wife. It was a condition he expected her to absorb. In 1920, 6 years into the marriage, 4 children born, Rose stopped absorbing it. She went back to her parents' house in Dorchester and did not return. She told her father she could not go back. She stayed for several weeks. Her father sent her back. Here is what that moment looked like from the inside. Rose was 29. She had no income, no assets in her own name, no professional qualifications. The money in the marriage was Joseph's, accumulated, managed, controlled entirely by him. She had 4 children, and a wife who left the marital home in 1920. Massachusetts had no guarantee of keeping them. The law gave courts wide discretion. A woman who had abandoned the household had weakened her position considerably. She was Catholic. The church did not permit divorce. A separated woman remained her husband's wife before God, and before every institution that governed her world. There was no version of departure that didn't also require departing from her faith, her community, and her children. And her father was a Catholic politician in a Catholic city who could not afford the story. These were not arguments Honey Fitz had to make in sequence. They were conditions Rose already understood. The walls didn't close around her in 1920. They had always been there. That was simply the moment she tested them and found them solid. She went back. What changed was not the marriage. Joseph's behavior continued, publicly, without apology, for decades. What changed was Rose. She deepened her faith with the intensity of someone who needs it to do structural work. She systematized the household, schedules, routines, eventually the famous index cards, imposing order on a domestic situation that was not, in human terms, orderly at all. She built a life within the marriage that occupied territory Joseph didn't want, and therefore couldn't take from her. This is sometimes written as Rose finding herself. It was adaptation. It was what survival looked like when exit was not available. The rule of silence didn't require a threat. It required every surrounding institution, the church, the law, her father, her financial situation, to make speaking cost more than staying quiet. It worked. She was quiet for 80 years. When she wrote her memoir at 83, with full authority, with no one left to silence her, she wrote about Joseph with composed, consistent warmth. She did not write about 1920. The silence had run so long it had become the voice, who she was required to protect, and the daughter that protection cost her loyalty to the Kennedy name was not a sentiment. It was an operational requirement, with measurable demands. Its specific cost had a name: Kathleen. Kathleen Kennedy, Kick, Rose's fourth child, was magnetic in the way that occasionally stopped rooms. Warm, quick, fearless in ways that went beyond the Kennedy competitive drive into something more genuinely free. She went to London during the war, worked for the Red Cross, and fell in love with William Cavendish, the Marquis of Hartington. Cavendish was Protestant. The church would not recognize the marriage unless Cavendish agreed to raise the children Catholic. He would not agree. A Catholic who married outside the church in a civil ceremony was denied the sacraments. This was not a preference that could be negotiated around. It was the outer boundary of the world Rose had organized her entire life to inhabit. Kathleen married him anyway. May 6, 1944. A civil ceremony in London. Joseph Kennedy attended. Rose did not. She did not attend her daughter's wedding, not a scheduling conflict, not distance. Rose Kennedy was absent from the room where her daughter was married because the rule of loyalty to the family's Catholic identity was more binding than her presence at that ceremony. She knew what it cost Kathleen. She did not go. 4 months later, Cavendish was killed in Belgium. Kathleen was widowed at 24. She stayed in England. She fell in love again with Peter Fitzwilliam, a divorced British peer. They planned to marry. What multiple historical sources report is that Rose's response was not passive. If Kathleen pursued this second relationship outside the church, Rose would publicly disown her. The historical record on the exact terms of that ultimatum is disputed. What is not disputed, on May 13, 1948, Kathleen and Fitzwilliam were killed when their chartered plane crashed in France. She was 28 years old. She was buried at Chatsworth, the Devonshire estate, not in Boston, not with her family. A small headstone, the inscription chosen by the Duke of Devonshire, not by the Kennedys. Rose visited the grave once. The machinery protected the institution. The institution did not protect Kathleen. The performance of composure, what 50 years of it does to the person performing. In virtually every photograph taken of Rose Kennedy, across 50 years of documentation, she is composed, posture correct, expression calibrated, warm enough to read as maternal, controlled enough to read as dignified. She once described, to journalists who found it charming, her system of index cards for each of her 9 children, medical records, clothing sizes, school schedules. The journalists wrote about the cards as evidence of an extraordinary organizational mind. What the cards also document, she was running the lives of 9 children while her husband maintained, at extended geographic distance, what amounted to a parallel life. He returned regularly, but the daily infrastructure, the discipline, the Catholic moral framework, the structure that produced what the world later called the Kennedy character, that was Rose's work, and it was credited, in the family's public narrative, to Joseph's vision. The foundation did the structural work. The foundation received no architectural credit. The rule of appearance demanded one thing above all. Her feelings were a private matter. The family's image was a public one. These two things were never to intersect. On November 22, 1963, Rose was at the compound in Hyannisport when her son Ted came to tell her that John had been shot in Dallas. She went to her room. Then she went to Mass. Then she walked on the beach. She said later she kept moving because stopping was not an option. If she stopped, she would not start again. The cameras found her at every public moment of that grief. The funeral, the memorials, the years of public appearance that followed. She was composed. She was correct. She did not break. This was called her faith, her strength, the Kennedy character. What it was, a woman who had been inside this machinery for 50 years, who had internalized its requirements so completely that she applied them even in the worst moment of her life. The performance had run so long it had fused with the person. That is what the rule of appearance produces when it operates without interruption. Not a mask, something more total than a mask, a replacement. There are millions of women whose version of this story was never filmed, who kept the household running, absorbed the costs, and were praised for not breaking, because breaking wasn't something the system had made room for. Their index cards were thrown away. That's why this story matters beyond the Kennedys. The machinery that ran Rose Kennedy's life wasn't unusual. It was the default operating system of mid-20th century American marriage, running simultaneously in millions of households. It left the same mark in every one of them. If this is the first time you've encountered a story named this way, this channel tells them. Subscribe. What she was allowed to have. What belonged to him? The financial architecture of captivity. Joseph Kennedy made a fortune in banking, film, real estate, the stock market, and liquor importation after Prohibition's repeal in 1933. Whether he operated in bootlegging before repeal is a question historians have examined and not conclusively answered. What is documented? By the mid-1930s, he was among the wealthiest men in America. Rose had no independent access to that wealth. The legal doctrine of coverture, under which a married woman's financial identity was subsumed into her husband's, had been substantially reformed by the early 20th century. The practical reality lagged the reform by decades. What Rose brought into the marriage became, functionally, Joseph's to manage. What was earned during the marriage was his. Joseph structured the family's finances through a series of carefully designed trusts. He created separate trusts for each child, funding them generously, ensuring that each Kennedy heir would eventually have financial independence. He understood that money meant freedom. He did not create that structure for Rose. For household expenses, across multiple properties, with a large staff, Rose managed accounts that Joseph provided. The distinction that matters: managing expenses is administration. Controlling capital is power. She had the administration. He had the power. In 1920, when she went to her parents' house and told her father she couldn't go back, this is part of what she was working with. No income, no assets, no financial exit. The money was his, structured to remain his, in a system designed, not maliciously, simply by default, to make departure economically impossible. When Joseph suffered a stroke on December 19, 1961, he lost the ability to speak and was left severely physically impaired. He lived 8 more years in that condition. The man who had controlled the financial architecture of Rose's life became dependent on it, on her. She managed his care. She traveled more in those years than she had before. Paris, Rome, the fashion houses she had always loved. She made more of her own decisions. Observers noted she seemed, in some ways, more fully herself during that period than in any prior decade. The freedom arrived when the man holding the structure was no longer capable of holding it. Joseph died in 1969. His estate passed into the trusts he had built. Rose was provided for, generously, by professionals he had employed for decades. Even in death, the architecture was his. What the dynasty required of her as a mother, and what it authorized without her knowledge, Rose Kennedy had 9 children in 17 years. She ran their daily lives with systematic precision, while Joseph was largely elsewhere. The discipline, the faith, the structure, hers. The rule of motherhood in the Kennedy household was not, love them and keep them safe. It was, produce children who serve the dynasty. Joseph required his children to compete and win. Rose enforced the Catholic framework. Together they built the Kennedy ethos, galvanizing, relentless, and, for one child, catastrophically unsuited. Rosemary Kennedy was born in 1918, Rose's 3rd child. From early childhood she was different, slower to develop, gentler in temperament, unable to match the pace the family required. She was, by the assessment of historians who have examined her case in depth, most comprehensively Kate Clifford Larson, in Rosemary, the hidden Kennedy daughter, likely mildly to moderately intellectually disabled. Rose worked with her directly, tutored her, found schools that could accommodate her. The historical record shows Rose genuinely engaged, not dismissive. As Rosemary reached her 20s, she became harder to manage. She had mood episodes. She was increasingly visible within the family's social world as someone who could not meet its standards. In 1941, Joseph Kennedy met with Dr. Walter Freeman and Dr. James Watts, the American physicians then promoting the prefrontal lobotomy as a treatment for behavioral and cognitive difficulties. Joseph authorized the procedure. Rosemary was 23 years old. Rose was not consulted. Rose was not told. This is documented. Larson's research, drawing on family accounts and institutional records, establishes clearly that the decision was Joseph's alone. Rose did not know what was being done to her daughter. The lobotomy destroyed Rosemary. She lost the ability to speak clearly, to walk without assistance, to function independently. She was institutionalized at St. Coletta School in Wisconsin, where she would live for the rest of her life. For approximately 20 years, the family did not discuss Rosemary publicly. She was absent from photographs, from events, from the family's official narrative. Rose was not given the full truth of what had happened. When Rose's memoir addresses Rosemary, the prose is so carefully controlled, it reads like a wound that was bandaged but never cleaned. She wrote about her daughter's difficulty. She wrote about the institutions, the prayers, the visits. She did not write about the surgery. She began visiting Rosemary at St. Coletta's in the 1960s, once the silence within the family had partially lifted. She brought gifts. She sat with her daughter. She came back. What she was sitting with, in that room, every visit. A daughter whose brain had been cut without her knowledge or consent, by the man she was required to be publicly loyal to, whose destruction she had been required to be publicly silent about for 20 years. She visited until she could no longer travel, the mechanisms that made leaving impossible, and what staying, for 80 years, finally produced Rose Kennedy tried to leave once. She was 29. She went home, told her father she was done, and stayed for several weeks. Her father sent her back. The mechanisms have been named: the church, the law, the money, her father's political interests. What matters now is not the list. It is what the list produced. She went back. She stayed. She outlived nearly everyone who had written the rules she lived inside. Joseph died in 1969. John had been assassinated in 1963. Robert in 1968. Her son Joe in 1944. Her daughter Kathleen in 1948. She buried 4 of her 9 children. She sat at 4 funerals with correct posture and an appropriate expression and did not break. And in the years after Joseph's death, something shifted. Quietly, without announcement. She traveled more. She made her own decisions. She managed her own calendar and her own correspondence with the same systematic precision she had applied to everything, but now on her own terms. She was, in those years, the last person standing who understood the whole system. Everyone who had enforced it was gone. Everyone who had benefited from it was gone, or elsewhere. She remained. She walked on the beach at Hyannis Port. She went to Mass. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her in her final decades, formidable, sharp, occasionally withering, capable of warmth and also of a coldness that could stop a room. She had been shaped by a machine that ran for 80 years. It had not made her soft, the one beneath all the others, the one the title is about. Silence, the beach, grey sky, water. The title of this documentary promises something, that Rose Kennedy was nastier than you thought. It is time to say precisely what that means. Rose Kennedy was not a passive sufferer. She was not a woman who endured the Kennedy machinery without understanding it. She understood it more completely than anyone around her, because she had been forced to understand it in order to survive it. And what she did with that understanding is the most complicated part of this story. She used it. She enforced the same rules on her children that had been used to contain her. The silence requirements, the loyalty requirements, the appearance requirements, the demand that private suffering never surface as public inconvenience. When Kathleen wanted to marry outside the church, Rose enforced the church's position with full knowledge of what that enforcement cost. She had paid versions of that cost herself. She enforced it anyway. When the family mobilized around Ted Kennedy's political survival after Chappaquiddick in 1969, after Mary Jo Kopechne drowned when Ted drove a car off a bridge on Chappaquiddick Island on July 18th of that year, the response followed the same institutional playbook that had governed Kennedy crises for decades. Rose was 79 years old. She had managed versions of this before. The machinery managed. The family's political survival managed. This is what nastier than you thought actually means. Not cruelty in the personal sense. Not malice. Rose Kennedy was not, by any credible account, a petty or vindictive person. She was demanding, formidable, sometimes cold. But the accounts of people who knew her also describe genuine warmth, genuine humor, genuine faith, what she was. The willing custodian of a system that damaged people. A system she knew caused damage, because she was one of the people it had damaged. And she maintained it anyway, because it was the only structure she had, because it had become indistinguishable from her identity, and because the alternative was the kind of chaos that the system had spent 80 years convincing her would destroy everyone she loved. That is the rule beneath all the other rules. The institution must survive. Everything else, her autonomy, her daughter's wedding, her daughter's brain, her grief, her own interior life, was negotiable. The institution was not. She could not follow this rule completely. No one can fully subordinate their humanity to an institution without residue. The residue was her. It was the Wellesley she never attended, held for 80 years in a single sentence said once. It was 1920, the departure that was never spoken of, the weeks at her parents' house that never made it into her memoir. It was sitting across from Swanson at that dinner with correct posture and something else, something she never named, that Swanson felt and never forgot. It was Rosemary's room at St. Coletta's, the gifts she brought, the visits she kept making long after they changed nothing. When journalists asked Rose Kennedy, near the end of her life, what she thought of everything, the losses, the decades, all of it, she said, "I have my faith. I have my children. I have no regrets." She said it calmly, without drama. The way you say something when the container has become so much a part of you that you can no longer find the seam between the container and yourself. The system produced this. Not Joseph alone, not her father alone, not the archbishop or the church or the law alone. All of it, together, operating as a structure so ordinary for its time that no one called it a structure. It was simply how things were, what was expected, what was natural. Rose Kennedy was not weak. She was not foolish. She was one of the most capable women of her generation, capable enough that the system recruited her intelligence in service of its own survival. That is what the machinery does when it runs well. It doesn't break the strongest women. It deputizes them, and then it asks you to admire what it made. The machinery didn't disappear when Rose Kennedy died on January 22nd, 1995, at the age of 104. It got quieter. It learned better manners. It changed its vocabulary. But it is still running, and now you can see it.